Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be focusing on infighting between IT and HR departments, a conflict in which HRIS is sometimes the battlefield.
The control of information can confer power, so it's not surprising that HRIS can be a source of strife.
A battlefield where IT and HR indulge in some friendly jousting. Like when the IT department wants to impose its ERP, but HR would prefer to use a tool of its choosing, but which is less prescriptive, for example.
Divergent interests. The balance of power, and, in the background, questions about defining boundaries between departments. So, HRIS and infighting, what's the story?
Enthusiasm for the digital transformation, which has changed our relationship to space and time, and tricked us into believing that the old borders and silos are gone, must not be allowed to hide human nature, which is inherently fearful and risk-averse. These instincts are at the heart of our need to control things, to defend our territory.
We can look at a company, or its IT systems for that matter, as spaces whose geography shifts depending on the balance of power, the policies in force, and perceptions and influences at work.
The authorizations, rights and roles of applications are digital territories of sorts. It's all tangled up together like topography maps, which must be stacked up to form a whole. The concept of borders definitely hasn't disappeared, though the nature of the borders themselves has probably changed.
HRIS is a playing field where the respective prerogatives of the HR and IT departments come together, and where borders can still precipitate a quarrel or two.
At the simplest level, a company's business can be sorted into 4 categories: organizational structure, the processes that make it a reality, the information that feeds them, and the people that bring the structure to life.
Within the framework of resource optimization, which is still the approach used by many companies, HR's responsibility is to optimize human resources.
And that translates to workforce planning at the collective level, and suitable employee position pairings at the individual level.
And of the 4 categories mentioned, people and organizational structure are clearly HR territory, while IT's domain is information and the processes that circulate information.
Each department wants to optimize its own resource, human capital used for the organizational structure in the case of HR, and the information capital used by processes for IT.
As always, the conflict focuses on the area where resources are shared, in this case when information is shared with people, with the former serving as an instrument of power for the latter.
Inefficiency appears at the border between respective contributions, so here that's between the process and the organizational structure. The processes aim to achieve a level of integration that is not necessarily in line with the needs of the organizational reality.
Moreover, for the past several years, companies have begun to shake the pure, rigid logic of productivity. They've begun transformations to achieve greater levels of agility, which has redefined HR and IT roles in passing.
In this approach, optimization of consumed resources is no longer HR's sole purpose. It also has to create collective intelligence. To caricature the situation, HR is now concerned with human potential and IT has become an architect and urban planner.
This shift has redistributed the territories of these 2 departments, in particular with respect to the 4 categories we mentioned earlier: organizational structure, process, information, and people.
HR is now more interested in information than it was before as it strives to fulfill its new mission of developing its human capital and collective intelligence. As for IT, it is increasingly responsible for processes, but also for the organizational structures they serve.
Unfortunately, just because their respective territories have shifted doesn't mean that all sources of conflict and inefficiency disappear. In reality, they merely shift along with the new borders.
Conflict always arises in areas that consolidate people's power. In this case, the source of power has shifted from information itself to governance of IT systems. I don't control the water, but I do control the pipes and taps.
And ineffectiveness is a result of the increasingly complexity of IT systems.
If you need proof, look no further than HRIS projects and the roadmaps that guide them. They reveal a lot about the governance of the processes in question. The debate is now focused on what will be centralized versus local, who is responsible for authorizations, and who manages the benchmarks.
To recap, just because the missions and approaches of IT and HR departments have evolved, it doesn't mean that infighting and the resulting inefficiency are things of the past. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short.
Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.